Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LPL Winners Finals, round number 5, whatever you want to call this, overview and analysis here in the spring playoffs. We've got 2 series to cover today, and they are the most important up until this point. Not only will we know our first team from the top 4 to be eliminated, we will have our top 3 by the end of this video, but of course we are also going to know our first team to officially qualify for the LPL Finals, with Winners Finals taking place here today. That means that we will also know the first team to officially qualify for MSI out of the LPL. It's certainly an important and action-packed day. Would love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions on everything we're going to cover down in the comment section below. Who did you think was going to win both of these series, and did they go as you anticipated, or were there some surprises? Would love to know your thoughts on everything, of course, down below. If you want to know my thoughts on what I expected to see out of these 2 series, I, of course, previewed both of them in the previous video that we did on round number 4. You can check that out up in the iCard right now. We've covered every single round of the playoffs on this channel, of course, and also every single week of the regular season. And so, also, if you want to check out all of that stuff, if you want to do a deep dive on everything I've felt about the LPL over the course of this year, you can check out the playlist up in the iCard. But today is mostly going to be about the 2 matchups that are really important right now. You know, a team getting eliminated, big deal. That's not qualifying for MSI. That's getting rid of your opportunity to be in the LPL Finals. And then, of course, qualifying for MSI, qualifying for the Finals, even bigger of a deal. And so, a lot of good stuff to cover. Of course, if you are new here, what we do on this channel is we're going to go game by game in both of the series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team is able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game. And at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will also be previewing our semifinals that we will know by the end of this video, the lower bracket finals, whatever you want to classify that as. And we're going to talk about who I think might be joining the winner of today's Winners Finals in the finals, you know, at MSI, all of that stuff, and what I think could potentially be happening moving forward for the LPL. So a lot of great action and exciting things to talk about, but of course, most of this video is going to be spent on going over the series that we saw this past weekend. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Kicking us off, it's going to be the lower bracket series. We got to wait a bit for Winners Finals. Lower bracket ended up happening first, and I was still very excited about this series, especially on paper. It was the number 3 seeded JD Gaming versus the number 5 seeded Ninjas in Pyjamas. Both of these teams looking pretty different, I would say, coming into this series. Ironically enough, the team that I think is going to be favored, JD Gaming, has looked worse over the last couple of weeks, at least in my opinion. Really didn't end the regular season all that strong. They were losing games that they probably shouldn't have lost, and they cost themselves the number 2 seed because of it, regardless of whether or not you think they are better or worse than top esports. Obviously, them getting destroyed by TES in the upper bracket here is certainly a sign that maybe they weren't a top 2 team coming out of the regular season, but on paper, everybody's been considering this a big 2, and then like top esports kind of at like 2.5 in terms of what your S tier in the LPL is like. JD Gaming has always been considered one of the best teams in the LPL, so to see them down here in the lower bracket, you know, essentially right at the start of the double elimination stage, it's just not, I think, what a lot of people would have expected going into playoffs, but they really are struggling in a couple of key areas. Now, there are a couple players that I think are still playing really well right now. I think topside has just generally been a strength for them this year. Basically, no matter who's been in, whether it's been Flandre or Sheer, it's clearly going to be Flandre for their playoff run, which I think is fine. I don't really think that one is like definitively better than the other in every area. I think they both have their strengths and their weaknesses, but I'm really glad that they're just choosing to stick with one. I think the worst thing you can do here is swap them in and out, you know, try to mix up the formula too much, get comfortable with a group of 5 players that can get used to communicating together. That's probably your best shot to keep going. And then also the biggest positive is, of course, Kanavi in the jungle, who is still excellent. He wasn't perfect in that series against TES, but he also wasn't the biggest problem. You know, you have to assume that Kanavi is going to be a massive strength for JDG in basically every single series they have. This guy's been the best jungler in the world for at minimum 2 years in a row now, and I really don't even think that it's all that debatable, if we're being entirely honest. Peanut, Canyon, like, these are good players. You know, even someone like a Shun, like, they're good players, but they don't have the track record that Kanavi has over the past couple of years, and so you're going to imagine that he is going to be just fine in this playoff run, but everybody else has been at least a bit concerning. Yagao was somebody who concerned me a lot in the regular season. I don't think he was really all that consistent when they were playing a lot of games, but as they've gotten into the playoffs, I do think he's gotten a bit better for this team, which is a good sign. It's kind of the opposite for Ruler and Missing, though. When you look at what they were doing at the beginning of this year, they were dominating as per usual. It was Ruler and Missing, pretty classic Ruler and Missing. The first half of the regular season, you can make a strong argument they were the best bot lane in the league. They were right up there with Elkanon. Wherever you wanted to kind of put them in that conversation, I think would have been relatively valid. But you get to the final week or two of the regular season, things aren't quite clicking in the same way. It's fine. You're chalking that up to just natural variance. Maybe they're just not taking the end of the regular season all that seriously. These are players that have always stepped up when games matter more. And so you're expecting them to get better in playoffs, but playoffs so far have just kind of been an extension of that bad play, in my opinion, especially against top esports, where they were just thoroughly outclassed by Jackie Love and Mako. It really was not close. Like, it was a bot gap. And that's really not something I think I've ever said about Ruler and Missing. It's one of the worst series that both of them have had individually as well as a duo, and so you're really hoping that they can figure something out and kind of turn that around here against Ninjas in Pyjamas, but I actually don't think the form is all that good. And, you know, I said this in my preview video. It's really up to whether or not this bot lane can figure it out, to me, whether or not JDG is going to struggle in this series. If this bot lane's fine, they're probably going to win. If this bot lane continues to look like they did against TES, and even to a much lesser extent against Weibo Gaming, where they were kind of the weakness of that team, then I don't think it's going to be nearly as easily, because Fodak and Juo have actually been pretty good, I would say, over the course of this split. Maybe not perfect, but good enough, and that transitions into Ninjas in Pyjamas. This is a rookie-led team. There's really not a lot of other ways to describe it. He is the superstar here, and I think if NIP is going to be looking for an avenue to win this, it's through mid lane, because I do think they have the advantage in that stage of the map, and mid lane is so important, especially in terms of establishing prio right now. If Rookie is just straight up better than Yagao, which I think is absolutely a possibility, they could walk away with the series relatively easily. Shanji and Aki have been struggling on the top side, and Flandre and Kanavi, I would say, are the strengths of their team, but Aki's going to need to step up in order for this team to be relevant, and Fodak and Juo actually need to take advantage of some of the mistakes that Ruler and Missing are making right now, again, in order to make this series interesting. But I think all of those things are possible. JDG are favorites going into the series for a reason, but I certainly don't think it's going to be unwinnable for Ninjas in Pyjamas. My prediction was JDG, I believe 3-1 or 3-0. It was one of the two. They absolutely are favorites, and it would be an upset if they ended up losing, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility for them to drop a couple of games or even the whole series if things end up going really poorly for them. So the only way to find out how that ends up going is to, of course, go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was JD Gaming. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is what you wanted to see in game 1. You wanted to see them come out and kind of play their own style, their own tempo. You've got a ton of options on this team. I really like this more balanced draft. I think we've seen a lot of teams index either really heavily into trying to win early or really heavily into trying to scale into the late game. I think both of these teams gave themselves more options. Ninjas in Pyjamas a little bit more scaled into the laning phase, the early pressure, the early prio, and JDG ended up winning that anyways because they actually have a lot of tools to be able to deal with that as well, but you still have a lot of backup plans. I think specifically the Azir is really, really good for this comp. I'm a big fan of Azir plus, early game AD carry, whether it's Kalista, whether it's Draven, whether it's, whoever, right? Even something like Azaya, I think could fit that role relatively well. Whatever you want to say is like a lane bully, I think that plus Azir has always been a relatively potent combo across the world, and it's just very consistent. And when you are able to perform really well, and when your players are stepping up, then you get performances like this, where the game gets out of control a little bit early. Ninjas in Pyjamas actually do a good job of trying to fight back in a couple of these fights, and I'll give credit where credit's due, when we get to them, but JDG never really lost full control of the map, and that meant that they ended up walking away with the win here. Player of the game for me is going to go to Missing in the support position on the Ashe. I've kind of been critical of this team's ability to play double marksman over the course of this year. It just hasn't necessarily felt as good as some other teams at this level, but this was a really good Ashe game. Very proactive arrows, and just generally very important damage coming out. Oftentimes we can underestimate the effect that double marksman can have, not only in terms of like, oh yeah, of course Ashe brings the slows and the traditional support stuff, and you build her like that, but she still does a lot of damage. Like, the auto attacks are still going to hurt, and she still does a lot of auto attacks. And so you're really looking at a champion that I think can fill a couple of different roles and can be very useful in a lot of different ways in fights, and Missing was excellent in this game. So I want to give him big credit for that, but it was far from him. I think this was more of a team effort than it was one player just kind of dominating. Ruler was excellent in this game on the Kalista, and this is the kind of performance that I really wanted to see out of Ruler and Missing. I think verbatim what I had said was, I expect Ruler and Missing to turn it around in this series, but this is the final series that I'm going to give them that leeway for. If they aren't able to figure it out against Photic and Juo, against Ninjas and Pyjamas, then I'm going to start getting concerned. Luckily for me, I don't need to start getting concerned because they look exactly like they should in game number 1 here. The Kalista was excellent. The Ashe bounced off of it really well, and I think both of them did their jobs. Ruler was never in danger. It was never really feeling like he was ever going to be put in a position where he had to make any sort of sacrifice. He was just dominating the early game, and he was still relevant as the game continued to go along. He did his job perfectly. This is how you play Kalista at a high level. Yagao was very good on the Azir. Again, he stepped it up, I think, in the playoffs for this team, which is super important, especially in this matchup. If Yagao is better than Rookie, I don't think NIP has a chance. Like, that really is kind of the defining factor for me. And Flandre and Kanavi were also very good. Flandre, I think, you know, it was fine. He was a top laner. He didn't really have to do a whole ton this game, and you could argue that Shanji was maybe a little bit better in lane, which is not ideal in terms of this matchup, but it didn't really matter. And then Kanavi, mostly the sacrificial lamb in a lot of these fights, ended up going in a bit too deep every once in a while, but again, he controlled the map so well, especially in the mid game. It's really his strength as a player. He allowed the Azir and the Kalista and the Ashe to be able to take over and carry some of these fights, and so that's all he really needed to do. He's Vi. That's the job of the champion. So nice win for JDG, but for NIP on the other side, a little bit of a disappointing loss. You tried your best to get Photic some sort of way to win this game, but he was way too passive, and honestly, we'll talk about that. This felt like old Photic rather than what we've been seeing out of him in 2024. The Photic that I'd been complaining about for a lot of different years. That was kind of the one that showed up here in game number 1, but dead of the game for me is going to go to Aki. When you lose pressure so early on in the game on Xin Zhao, it's just so hard to recover. This champion doesn't really have a lot of options or tools to be able to get himself back into the game if things do end up going wrong, and so when you get to a point and you're R5ing the Xin Zhao to try to get a good matchup in the jungle, to try to get pressure early on in the game, to try to shut down JDG, and you're still not able to do that, it's definitely not ideal, especially because you also drafted the Talia, so you're indexing heavily into trying to establish this pressure around objectives. You want to get these skirmishes going. You want to try to get the Xin Zhao moving and eventually hopefully translate that pressure down into the Jinx around dragons and, you know, skirmishes down in the bot lane, maybe 4v4s, things like that. But it just never ended up happening. Like, again, they were able to pull back some gold in the middle of this game. It just never really felt like they were actually in it. It felt like they were delaying the inevitable, and I think a lot of that was Aki just not having any pressure at all in this game. Like we said, Aki is going to have to step up and be relevant in order for this team to be at all in this game, and he just wasn't here. I also think Photic, like I said, needed to be better. I know the Jinx isn't exactly the most consistent champion in the entire world, even though she probably should be. At least in Pro, she has not been over the course of this year. You want to be able to get this Jinx online. You are the late game win condition. This game going to 30 minutes means you need to be the most important player in the game, and there were moments where Photic looked like he had the opportunity to keep things in check, but he was just way too passive, in my opinion, in terms of his positioning. This was something I complained about a lot in 2022 when this team was Victory 5 and they were trying to make a Worlds push, was that he just wasn't stepping up and making the big plays. It's honestly been a problem in his playoff run so far. I think he's scared of making the wrong plays because he has made a lot of wrong plays in his playoff runs in the past for important teams, and so I don't really know if it's a mental thing, but way too scared, way too passive. Juo, I think, could be in a similar boat, I should say. You just need to see more aggression. You know, Ricky couldn't really do anything on the Talia once Xin Zhao lost pressure early, and then Shanji was fine this game. I honestly don't think he was the problem, but for NIP, it just kind of feels like they didn't really execute on the things that they wanted to execute on in draft. You draft this early game comp that wants to control the map, and you just aren't able to do that. Maybe you need to transition into something that can be a bit more reactive, because JDG definitely looks like they're going to grab a lot of the momentum, but are they going to be able to keep it in game 2? You do not want to go down 2-0 to a team like JDG. Having to win 3 games in a row against them is impossibly hard. It is truly a ridiculous challenge, and so for NIP, you got to win this game number 2, but for JDG, you can really put this series in a tough position if you end up winning this one. So, who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was JD Gaming. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up 2-0 in this series, and things are spiraling out of control for Ninjas in Pyjamas very quickly. It just doesn't feel like they are on the same level as a team like JDG in this series. I mean, they were able to control a couple parts of this map. Photic was able to get quite a bit of gold. You went for a very eclectic draft that, I'm going to be honest, I really don't like all that much, and you tried your best, but at the end of the day, it just wasn't enough. JDG has a little bit too much firepower for you to be able to overcome, and unfortunately, it really was just like a 2v8, and they ended up winning the 2v8, which is really not a great circumstance to end up being in. We'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game is obviously going to go to Flandre. They don't win this without the Twisted Fate, and honestly, he's played this champion so well, not only in the playoffs, but in the regular season as well. It feels very up his alley in terms of the way he likes to play. Not to say he likes to be isolated, not to say that he likes to be this kind of individual solo player, but I think having the opportunity to be a macro presence and to be able to win lane a lot more consistently, it's just something that I think really fits what Flandre wants to do as a player. And so really like what he was able to do in this game. Again, I can't reiterate enough. I don't think they win this game as easily without the TF. I'm not going to say it was entirely him, but I don't think I'm breaking the mold by saying that it would have been a lot more difficult if he had not been as good in this game as he was. So credit to Flandre. He has been excellent in this playoff run. Obviously, he obliterated Weibo Gaming. That series was all him. I mean, it was the rest of the team too. Like, Kanavi and Yagao still played really well in that series in particular, but Flandre really was the driving force, the carry, the dominant player across all three of those games. He got player of the game for me in all three of them. So, you know, he's been having a good playoff run, and I think generally them settling in on a player that does have a lot of playoff experience, that does know how to play in big moments, it's really going to help them moving forward. Even if I was a big proponent of Sheer throughout the year and, you know, what he was able to do, the guy beat 369 in lane for crying out loud in the regular season. Flandre gives you something that I just don't think you're going to get out of a young player that's basically never played at any competitive level before this year. So credit to Flandre. He's been excellent. I want to give a big shout out to this bot lane as well. Like I said earlier, if the bot lane is not nearly as good as they are, they do not win this series. I truly think that that is kind of the break point for JDG, even with, as well as, you know, Kanavi and Yagao and Flandre have been playing throughout the playoffs. I think Ruler and Missing really are kind of the turning point for whether or not this team can make MSI and really live up to the expectations they have for themselves, and Ruler and Missing have been very good through the first two games. The Zeri and the Nautilus, they were definitely the other two pieces on this team that I think were actively helping out what JDG was doing, because I really wasn't a fan of how Kanavi and Yagao ended up playing this out. I think Yagao in particular did a lot of things that I just don't particularly love out of the Karma. If you're going to be aggressive as a support, like if you're going to be a facilitator that wants to step up and really try and engage all the time, you need to be in positions where you can actually do that. Your positioning has to be very good. Your ability to survive in fights has to be high, and you need to be able to not make yourself a priority target. And he just wasn't doing that. I don't think either jungle mid particularly played well in this game. Kanavi was fine on the Jax, especially in some of the later fights. I think he did everything he was supposed to do then, but I really don't like how either of these teams play the early game. It was enough for JDG to end up being able to take the win, but I think they gave over way too much to Ninjas in Pyjamas, essentially for no reason. They allowed, you know, Fodic and Shanji at times to be able to get online and actually try to keep this game interesting. So I do think there are some things that JDG need to clean up. I mean, stop me if you've heard that before throughout the playoffs, but at least they were able to pick up the win. Flandre was by far the best player in this game, and Ruler and Missing did a great job, I think, of capitalizing on the things they needed to capitalize on, but really they don't win this without the TF. And then for NIP on the other side, I don't know why I said it like that. And then for Ninjas in Pyjamas on the other side of the map, you know, some good things as well. This is a very weird draft, and I think weird can most of the time be considered good at this level. I don't often think that you pulling something out that other teams aren't prepping for is ever really a bad thing, especially if you feel super comfortable on it, unless it's just like unplayable. And I think Nasus is pretty playable, but Nasus isn't really the problem that I have with this draft. I don't love it because you're giving over so much prio in the early game to that TF. He's going to have such a big macro presence, and we saw kind of the consequences of that pick, I would say, throughout the game. But I really hate Sejuani plus Taliyah as a mid-jungle duo in a meta where it is so important to establish priority in the middle of the map. I just don't really know how you do that with these two as a duo. Typically speaking, if you want to draft Sej, you want to draft something late game or alternatively high damage in the mid lane. You can go something like Tristana if you want to go early game in the mid lane, but I think going something like Taliyah, it doesn't really do either of those. You can't really facilitate a Taliyah in the back half of the game unless the player is dominating in the early game, which I just don't think was ever going to happen into the comp JDG had, especially with the surrounding core that NIP had in this game in terms of champions. Or alternatively, you want to draft something that can be really proactive in an early game sense. Again, like either a Trist or like an Azir, to me, would have been significantly better here. I love Azir plus Sejuani, or, you know, even Corki. I hate Corki, and it takes a lot of the, I guess, power away from the player, but, you know, I think it fits better into the idea here. I just don't love these two as a duo, and I think we saw kind of the consequences of that. Again, I don't think Rookie made any sort of major errors. He just never really got to do anything. If you drafted the Taliyah in order to match the TF, then why are you drafting the Nasus, who's also going to be matching the TF for a majority of this game? I just don't really understand the idea behind it, but dead of the game is going to go to Aki for me. I just don't think the Sej was all that valuable. I think more so than the Taliyah being a bad pick, I think you just go in a different direction than Sejuani in this game. If this was, you know, a Lee Sin or a Xin Zhao, which you yourself banned in the second rotation, then all of a sudden I think this draft changes entirely for me. You have a clear win condition, which is get Taliyah out on the map and gain a macro advantage so that TF doesn't actually have a lot of opportunities to be able to move around in the mid to late game, and then scale up for the Nasus. You know, Varus was in a good position. You actually had tools to be able to win it. I just don't think that this configuration of champions ended up working out. And I think Aki was kind of the biggest, negative point for that. I don't think the Sedge really had any sort of impact at all. Yes, they were able to get dragons and they were able to, kind of stack those. But as we've seen throughout not only the playoffs here in the LPL, but everywhere, dragons don't matter, like really at all right now. And Photic and Juo did get strong because of it, but did they get strong enough to actually be able to keep up with the macro presence that JDG had to be able to be first to every objective? No. So yeah, they were getting kills, like Photic was getting a lot of gold and Juo was more useful on the Ashe, but they were never going to be able to match the pressure that JDG was going to be putting on the map. And so overall, I just don't think it was really all that smart of a game for NIP, and they put themselves in a pretty big hole because of this. You need to put Rookie on something that he can carry on, that he can 1v9 on, because that's your avenue to win here. I don't hate every single piece of this team. I think Photic had a pretty good game here. Juo had a pretty good game here, but you just feel like you're off your game right now. And now it's do or die. It's win or go home. If you lose another game here in this series, your split is done. You have to win here in game 3, but JDG is in prime position to continue their streak of only going 3 games in every single series, whether for or against them. Can they clean this up with another sweep here against NIP, or is NIP going to keep this series alive and push us to a game 4? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Ninjas in Pyjamas. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to keep this series alive at the very least for one more game. There will be no sweep. And this is the first time JD Gaming's going to game number 4 in the entirety of their playoffs. They swept Weibo Gaming out of the tournament. They got swept by Top Esports to get into this series. And so I guess we'll see how it ends up going from here, but I'm not going to be entirely too surprised if JDG continues to look good. This was just a really nice win for NIP. A lot of the things that I asked for, I didn't necessarily get in the way that I asked for them, but I got kind of what I was looking for. I got a more early game focused jungler, somebody with a lot more active priority on the map in the Vi. Still not a huge fan of the Vi, would like something a little bit more aggressive. You yourself are banning out a lot of the aggressive junglers, and so if you want to try to take that away, I guess it's relatively fine, but the Vi in of itself it can work. It can work in a situation like this, and I think it did open up a lot more circumstances than something like a Sejuani did for this individual team. You're also adding on a much more aggressive AD carry and a much more aggressive bot lane with the Tristana plus the Rakan, 2 champions that can be very active, that can move around the map and be proactive and try to take a lot of these fights, and I think it did unlock a lot of what this team wanted to do a lot more. JDG indexing into that late game once again, really with the exception of the Rek'Sai flexing into the jungle. If NIP's going to ban out a lot of junglers, yeah, you can flex Rek'Sai relatively easily. TF is obviously big for this team, and Azir plus Zeri is such a consistent late game duo. I understand the idea behind this, but for all the analysis that I can give you here on these 2 team comps, JDG should have won this game. Like, there really is nothing else to say. They had full early priority. They were in full control of this game. This should have absolutely been a 3-0 sweep, and yet here we are sitting with NIP winning. We'll talk about it as we go further along, but player of the game simply has to go to Rookie. It is really hard to take over the game on Taliyah, not because that champion's weak. I've said multiple times that she is the strongest mid laner in the game. I feel that to the core of my being. I don't even think it's particularly close right now. She just does so much for your team. She can carry games, but it's just more difficult to do that than it would be on other champions, especially going into a team like JDG that does such a good job of shutting down the early game. Adding on top of the fact, if you're playing Taliyah from behind, it's even more difficult to try and take over the game. This is a champion that thrives on having map pressure and map priority, and if she doesn't have that, all of a sudden a lot of her tools that she uses to become really annoying and really difficult to deal with, they don't have nearly as much space to breathe. You don't really have as many ways to deal with that. You can't split push nearly as effectively because the enemy team can send, TF over and just stop it. You can't really team fight nearly as effectively because your damage takes a lot longer than the enemy teams will. And so you are sitting in a position where things do become significantly more difficult. But that's what makes Rookie so great. That's what makes him such an elite player, is that he can take a position like NIP were at in this game and he can turn it completely around and end the game in 29 minutes after being in a mega losing position at like 22 minutes into the game. It is genuinely insane how quick he was able to make this work for his team, and you just have to give him a lot of credit for that. He is truly playing like one of the best players in the entire world right now. Best mid laners is a really tough place to be. There are so many good ones. Knight, obviously here in the LPL, I think has pretty clearly been the number 1, but Rookie to me has been number 2. You look over in the LCK, like where does he stack up against Chovy and Faker and Zeka and Showmaker, who's having a good year? Like, there are so many good mid laners, but Rookie absolutely is in the conversation for being a top 10 player in the world right now, which is not somewhere he has been recently. He had his worst year in a long time last year on Top Esports, and so it's really nice to see him, get put in a position where he can actively be a positive for his team and for him to take advantage of it, for him to really kind of become that old rookie, the prime rookie that we know and love. Again, I think has been great. It wasn't just him. Big ups to Zhuo, who I think has been really good throughout this tournament and has been pretty good throughout this year. I think he's shown a lot of things that have made me feel a lot better about him as a starting caliber support for a team that does want to win. I think going into the year, the question was not, is NIP good enough? The question was, can this bot lane hold up? And the bot lane has held up. And I think Zhuo was very good at this game. I think the Tristana does help out the kind of proactivity that I was talking about, even if, again, they didn't do all that much in the early game. I think if you are looking for negatives, Aki, again, continues to kind of struggle with some of those more consistent engages. I think he gave over way too much in the early game to Kanavi. It ended up working out because the Vi was relevant in some of the late game team fights, even if he was getting blown up very quickly in some of these fights, but I just am not super sold on how Aki has played a lot of these games so far. I'm a big Aki fan, but I don't think this has been a good series for him. I think Shanji was good, definitely the better top laner down the stretch. The Udyr was just way more valuable than the TF, going from a position where he can just stand on the front line and force a 5v5, rather than JDG wanting to kind of play a little bit more off of that style. And so, I like how NIP played. Maybe they should have controlled the early game a bit more, especially with the draft that they ended up having, but to be able to make that comeback, to be able to keep your season alive after being in a really bad position, it's just a nice thing to see from them. For JDG, you probably should have closed this out in 3 games. This probably should have been another one of your sweeps, but you end up letting it slip through your fingers at the end. Hopefully that doesn't come back to bite you. That would be a disaster, but the problem that you ran into was that Rookie was the best player in this game. I've talked about this before, oftentimes with Chovy. Over in the LCK, it's very similar to what I talked about in that Genji Hanwha Life series, where I don't think individually JDG did all that much wrong in this game. I think you can look at like Flandre and Kanavi in particular on the top side and say like, okay, you needed to calm down a bit towards the back half of this game. Flandre kept getting caught out. Kanavi kept going in and dying immediately in fights. Like there were definitely some negatives, I would say overall, especially around the objective fights, but overall, I don't think this team played all that bad. They just didn't have the best player in the game in this particular game because that was Rookie. And so you ended up losing a lot of that pressure. The Talia was by far the most relevant champion, and you never really were able to recover from that spot. I don't think it's an indictment on them, but you should have closed out this game number 3. And if this becomes a bit of a problem, like this will haunt you. If you lose game 4 and somehow, some way you end up losing game number 5, that is going to stick in your mind forever, that this series absolutely should have ended in 3 games. You left Ninjas in Pyjamas in opening, and credit to them. They absolutely capitalized on it. They made the most of it. And now we're moving into game number 4. The series is still in a spot where it's only one more game for NIP. You still have to be perfect, essentially, throughout the rest of this series, but at least winning game number 3 proves to you that you can do it. Can they end up continuing this streak and, bring game number 4 back in their direction, push this to a Silver Scrapes game number 5 with all the momentum in the world, or is JDG going to say, game 3 was a little bit of an outlier, we threw it away in the back half, we were always the better team, and close this out in 4? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Ninjas in Pyjamas. They are going to take game number 4, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. They are really, really leaning into that reverse sweep archetype here because they have played excellent through the final, game and a half of this series up until this point. The back half of game 3 was awesome from them, and all of game 4 was super dominant from them. I think you could make a really strong argument this was the most dominant game of the series up until this point, but the fact that they are sitting here going to a game 5 against JDG, this has surpassed even my expectations of what they could do here. I was a lot higher on NIP throughout a majority of the year, but I felt very confidently in a top 3. I felt very confidently that BLG, JD Gaming, Top Esports were all significantly better than everyone else, even if I felt good about NIP potentially being the number 4 team in the LPL. But here we are going to game 5. They played excellent here in game 4, and JDG has to be sweating, because they took a surefire win in game number 3, threw that away, and then got blasted in game number 4, and now you're one game away from throwing it all away, from getting reverse swept, when you really should have been walking out of here with a sweep. That would be an absolute disaster for them, not only in terms of the way it happened, but in terms of the expectations. If they finish 4th in the LPL, that is a major disappointment. I think a lot of people, especially with a team like Bilibili being, one series away from in the finals, at MSI finishing 1st in the regular season, they're going to see that swap in the offseason. They're going to see that Yagao for Knight trade, and they're going to start to really be a bit concerned that management doesn't really know what's best for the team, or at least that's the narrative I've been hearing a lot online. So this is starting to become a bit of a disaster for JDG, but of course they still have the opportunity to rectify that by winning game 5. We'll talk about game 4 first before we get into that, of course. Player of the game is once again going to go to Rookie. I don't think this one is as obvious as it was in game 3. Game 3, it was like Rookie is saving this game. He's doing everything for the team. He's leading the entire game in damage, and it's by a lot, and he's really dominating. This game felt much more more like a team effort. Everybody really did their part, specifically Rookie and the bot lane, who I thought both were excellent, and truly those have been the 3 best players for Ninjas in Pyjamas over the course of this year. To see them step up in a really important moment, to see all 3 of them actually play really well, it is so encouraging. We know Rookie is a big-time player. This guy has won Worlds. He was on the first ever, Chinese team to win Worlds, and so we know that he can perform in big moments. We know he can step it up when it matters the most. However, to see Photic and Juo have such a good game in such an important situation for them to, quite frankly, just completely outclass Ruler and Missing here in game number 4, it's really impressive. I think the bot lane has actually been pretty good for JDG across this series. They've certainly been better in this series than they were against really Weibo or TES, but this was bad. Like, this was a bad game from them, and these are just the games you didn't get from Ruler and Missing last year. These are the games that you just wouldn't expect to get out of these two as a duo. I understand that it's only one game, but that's more than they, were putting out in 2023. And so for Photic and Juo to just kind of obliterate them in terms of the bot lane matchup, for Juo to be by far the most impactful member of this bot lane, for Photic to get super far ahead and be such a huge damage dealer on the Zeri in the back half of this game, you have to give them a ton of credit. There has been, talk about how this bot lane is going to hold Ninjas in Pyjamas back, about how Rookie is hard stuck on this team with not enough good talent around him. Photic and Juo have dispelled those rumors that even I was talking about a lot at the beginning of this year. They have been good enough for you to be able to get to a top 3, top 2 position across this year with, and they were excellent in this game. Again, outclassing Ruler and Missing is not easy. I want to reiterate that, and they did it pretty effortlessly in this one, but Rookie does deserve player of the game. He still is the one that was going out there and making the most plays, I would say, of anybody. He was the one they were driving a lot of their offense through, especially going into something like Vygar, which I do like a lot. He's not going to have that same kind of priority and pressure. He's just going to offer a lot of tools to help the rest of the team do well. Of course, he has a lot of damage and he can scale and he's got the cage and all of those things are very good, but when you're asking him to try and follow a Taliyah, to try and move around the map and be at the same plays that Taliyah is at, he's just not going to be able to do that as a champion. It's not even necessarily Yagao's fault, but Rookie was everywhere, and this game was out of control by 15 minutes, and a lot of that was the Taliyah. Shanji continues to look very good. I actually think he's been significantly better in this series than he has been recently. He was pretty good, I would say, all things considered, at the beginning of the playoffs against like Fun Plus Phoenix, but you look at that series against Bilibili and he got mega outclassed, and he was a concern about this team going into the playoffs because of how he performed in the regular season. He's been very good in this series. I think good enough at the very least. Outside of game 2, I don't really feel there's been any avenues where he's just gotten completely destroyed, and even in game 2, it wasn't entirely his fault. It was just Flandre, I think, playing really well, but he was definitely better here in game number 4, and then Aki was fine. Again, I don't love Nocturne. I think if it's going to work with something, Taliyah is like the perfect mid laner to try and get the most out of Nocturne, because Taliyah not only can follow up on plays like these other combo champions like the Nico or the Orianna that we've seen with Nocturne a lot, but also, Nocturne can still be useful in these fights. Like, Taliyah and Nocturne are both ideal for each other, I would say, and so I don't hate the pick as much as I would hate it in a lot of other circumstances, but I don't think Aki was the most important member of this team. I think a lot of it was Rookie, a lot of it was Photic, and a lot of it was Juo, who are the players that need to step up. For them to dominate their opponents as much as they did, it's huge, but for JDG, this bot lane letting them down in a key moment, again, I'm not going to sit here and say it was exclusively the bot lane, because I think that's taking a situation that isn't entirely true and trying to fabricate a story on it, but man, Ruler and Missing are concerning me. Missing's dead of the game. You could give this to Ruler. The bot lane was just not good enough in game number 4. There's really nothing else to say. They got obliterated by top esports. They weren't quite as good against Weibo Gaming, and then you look at some of their regular season performances, and it's like, is this even a top 5 bot lane in the LPL right now? Like, they're truly not playing like it, and you have to imagine that Ruler and Missing are going to figure it out at some point, but they've just simply not been good enough, and they were not good enough in this game. If you're going to give over so many resources to the enemy team, if the Rakan, if Juo on the other side of this is going to be the best player in this bot lane, that's concerning. If you're going to let Zeri get out of control, that's concerning towards what this team can accomplish. I know that a lot of this is Taliyah and Nocturne and this super heavy macro emphasis being moved around the map by Ninjas in Pyjamas, but Ruler and Missing typically are very good in the stage of the game where they can adapt to that, and it's just not happening right now. Missing was consistently going in when he didn't need to, and then by the end of the game was just getting picked off in bad places. Ruler was constantly being targeted first in a lot of these fights and had really no way to survive, and his positioning wasn't perfect. There are just real flaws with how they are playing right now, and it's costing them a lot of pressure. The rest of this team, I can understand why it didn't work. I'm not a big fan of Vi, and I think Vi plus Vygar, like the Vi-Gar mid-jungle duo, whatever you want to call it, I can see where that could just run into some issues issues when you've got hypermobile post 6 Nocturne, and you've got a Talia who can move around the map basically at will. You've got a Veigar who's really not all that good at roaming. That's not really what he does as a champion. And then you've also got a Vi who really needs a lot of that early pressure in order to be as relevant in the back half of the game. And so when you lose the early game, all of a sudden the game just starts spiraling. Flandre couldn't really do anything on the Ornn. He was put on weak side, and Shanji just got to take advantage of that in lane. This was just not good. And all the confidence and momentum that JDG could have had, it's gone. Like, it is disappeared out the window. Sayonara. It is not there anymore. If this team wants to win game number 5, they're going to have to do so with the knowledge that it's a comeback, because NIP has all of the momentum in the world right now. Rookie, Photic, Zhuo, they're playing out of their minds. There's still obviously an avenue for either team to win this, but I did not think this was going to go to a game number 5. But can JDG avoid disaster and avoid getting reverse swept out of the playoffs, or is Ninjas in Pyjamas going to complete that reverse sweep and move themselves into a stunning top 3 spot? Well, the winner of game number 5 was JD Gaming. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to avoid disaster in losing this 5th game, and they are going to move on to the semifinals with a chance to still make MSI, a chance to still win the LPL finals, all things considered. And again, this is truly avoiding disaster. You were never not supposed to win this series. It was never supposed to be this close under any circumstances, but Ninjas in Pyjamas, to their credit, fought back hard in game 3. They dominated game 4. They put in a really strong effort. It just wasn't enough. Even this game number 5, pretty slow. This is pretty typical from what we see out of game 5s. Even in regions like the LPL that are more aggressive, we often see a lack of really big proactive plays because these teams are afraid of making major mistakes. Their season is on the line, both of them. And so the game ends up slowing down a bit, but you get one big fight at around 20 minutes that ends up breaking the game wide open, and JDG can just end from there. Credit to them. They did what they were supposed to do. They ended up walking out with a win, which is all they were going to do, no matter what. But man, like, it didn't have to be this close. It really didn't have to be this close. So credit to NIP for actually keeping things interesting in a series that probably wasn't supposed to be as interesting as it was. Player of the game and player of the series, which might come as a pretty big surprise, is going to go to Yagao for me. I didn't feel super comfortable giving this to almost anybody on JDG. I don't think there is a particularly great answer for who the best player in this series was. Honestly, it's probably Rookie on the other side. I think Rookie was probably the best player across all 5 games. Not particularly fair to give player of the series to someone on the losing side, and so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give it to Yagao, because for as much as Rookie did, I don't think Yagao did anything particularly bad in this series. A lot of his negative moments, like on the Veigar, were just him not having the same kind of pressure on his champion as Rookie did on the other side of the map. Talia versus Veigar, it's just kind of how the matchup ends up going. So for Yagao, you do have to give him credit for being the person to step up when it mattered the most here in game 5, to be the carry of the team. You were kind of waiting for that Yagoat moment to show up again, and this is exactly where it showed up. Azir plus Xayah plus Xin Zhao. I've been talking about this combo, or at least something along the lines of this combo, for a long time. It's almost close to what I consider to be the Exodia draft right now, which is Maokai plus Azir plus anything like Xayah in the bot lane, most notably for me, Kalista. I think that really is kind of like your Exodia draft, but this is still pretty darn good in the same right. You want to give everybody on JDG their most comfortable champions, then yeah, Xin Zhao's perfect for Kanavi. It allows him to have that early game pathing pressure where he is the best in the world in that stage of the game. You give Missing his Rakan, which he's essentially undefeated on. This guy dominates every single time he gets this champion. He's not undefeated, but he is like undefeated in terms of pressure. And then Ruler gets Xayah, and he's played so much Xayah over the course of his career. It's just a lot of comfort. It's a lot of natural champions for this team, and they ended up executing really well, but it really was Yagao that I think ended up saving this. Azir has really proven his worth ever since being reinstated back into the meta here. He has been a crucial pick for basically every single team in the playoffs, and he was really important in this series as well, and Yagao really proving the merit of that champion. But overall, great game from JDG. I felt like Ruler and Missing played excellent here in the final one, which is great because they played so poorly in game 4 that if they ended up losing this series, a lot of blame, whether rightfully or not, was going to go on to them. The fingers were going to get pointed at JDG's bot lane, but luckily they avoid disaster. They play really well on the Xayah Rakan here in game 5, and they get to avoid whatever negative consequences would have come from them losing this. Kanavi was really good, in my opinion, probably his best game of the series here in game 5. Just a really consistent one. Maybe didn't have the same early pressure that maybe you would have hoped for, but his team fighting was excellent on the Xin Zhao, a champion that's really not known for that stage. And Flandre was solid here. Shanji certainly had problems on his signature rumble, and I think Flandre took advantage of it, but really this was a team effort. Yagao was the carry. He was definitely definitely the one that was given a lot of the resources and a lot of the options in order to succeed here, but JDG was the better team here in Game 5, and that's why they are moving on to the semifinals. For Ninjas in Pyjamas, unfortunately, this is the end of the road in the spring split. This will be the final games that they play in spring, and man, did they put up a fight. They were not favorited at all in this series. They were major underdogs. A lot of people didn't even think they would make top 4, let alone be able to compete with JDG in a series like this. For them to make it this far, for them to be as relevant as they were, for them to, try and come back, keep their mental, really play from behind in a very solid way in this series, you just got to give them all the kudos in the world, because truly they were excellent. They were everything they should have been in this series. Dud of the game, unfortunately, in Game 5 is going to go to Rookie. He was the driving force for that Game 3 comeback and for Game 4 on the Talia. But then he transitions off of the Talia. It's banned out here alongside the Ahri, alongside the LeBlanc, a lot of these signature picks for Rookie, and he settles on the Corki. And again, I understand the idea behind this, where these games typically go a lot slower. These games go a lot longer, typically these Game 5s between two teams, because both team seasons are on the line. They don't want to make these major mistakes. I talked about this earlier, but Corki is just something that does not have the kind of proactivity that you get out of other champions. Rookie has been essential in this series because he's been the primary initiator and playmaker for the team. When you take the initiative out of his hands, when you put that onto Aki or Zhuo, the entire team dynamic does change a bit. And unfortunately, I think that Corki pick might have ended up costing them this game. I'm not going to sit here and say they would have definitely won if they had picked something else, but I certainly don't think the Corki helped, and Rookie had no impact on this game. And for Rookie, your best player, to not really being given an opportunity to have an impact in the final game, it's a disastrous situation. And so, especially on R5, to go for the Corki here, I think was honestly a season-ending decision, but everybody else also lost. It's not like Rookie was the only player who was not relevant in this game. Photic and Zhuo had their worst game of the series up until this point. Not a great time for it to happen, but I think more of that credit goes to Ruler and Missing being good, rather than Photic and Zhuo being awful. Photic had a couple of really bad positioning moments in this game against some nerves, potentially getting to him. We've seen that in the past out of him as a player, but I'm not going to sit here and blame that entirely on them. They were so good throughout the rest of this series. They almost won game number 4 by themselves, and so you don't want to sit here and say that they couldn't step it up when the lights mattered the most. It just was an unfortunate time to have some problems. I do have some concerns about the top side. Shanji was fine in this series. I really didn't have any major issues outside of potentially Game 5 here where he wasn't as good, but Aki really struggled in this series for NIP. If you're looking at a player that maybe if they have a slightly better series, you're moving on into top 3, Aki, I think, could potentially be the answer to that. I'm not going to sit here and say, again, it was entirely his fault or anything, because I don't think he was the biggest problem in Game 5 in particular, but when you're looking at the 5 games, he was probably the weakest player on both teams in this series, and sometimes your weakest link is the most important player, and that just kind of is the unfortunate truth of it. But again, credit to NIP. It's really hard for me to be negative here because they pushed JDG to 5. They overperformed so much in terms of what other people's expectations were, and even mine. I was higher on this team. I didn't think they were going to go to 5 games with JDG, but they did everything they could. Rookie is one of the best players in the world, and hopefully they can retool and come back in summer and continue to push forward. If they're a top 4 team again, they could potentially be going to Worlds. And so for JDG on the other side, though, congratulations on making the semifinals. They will play the loser of the series that we talk about next in the semifinals in order to get a shot at whoever wins that series in the finals, but their run is not done yet. If they were ever going to face adversity, this was definitely adversity. Perhaps overcoming that can give them the confidence they need to go out in the semifinals and do everything they need to do, but they still have some major flaws. This team is not perfect by any means, but they were certainly good enough to get by today. But then moving on to our second of the series, and as important as the previous one was to keep yourself alive in the playoffs, this one might be more important because not only is this a qualification series for the LPL finals, but this is a qualification series for the mid-season invitational, the first big international tournament of the year. So both of these teams are going to be locked and loaded. The top 2 seeds, the number 1 seeded Bilibili Gaming taking on the number 2 seeded Top Esports. I'm very excited to see this clash because honestly, I really don't know what's going to happen. This is a very interesting matchup of 2 very mechanically talented teams that have kind of gotten away with being better than a lot of other teams because of just how talented they are, rather than having intense or insane macro in the same kind of way that you might see a team like Gen.G over in the LCK have. So it's going to be interesting. I think these 2 teams match up against each other on paper in a very intriguing kind of way because, like I said, a lot of mechanical talent, but it's really going to be about who steps up on any given day. Of course, we previewed the individual lane-by-lane matchups in that preview that we did in the previous video, so I'm not going to go as in-depth at the start of this, but to cut it a little bit short, there are a couple of lanes that I think are BLG favored and a couple of lanes that I think are Top Esports favored. I would traditionally say that mid lane might be the only lane that I would say is like really favored from one team over the other, with Knight predictably being being favored over Cream. I would say that that is definitely what I would anticipate, but Elkadon versus Jackie Love and Mako, it's probably the two best bot lanes in the league going head-to-head. Bin versus 369, certainly the two most talented top laners in the league going head-to-head, and probably the two best top laners going head-to-head. June versus Tion, two players that have been integral and crucial towards their team's success over the course of this year that rely a lot on early game advantages. This is going to be a fun series, and they match up against each other in a really interesting way. My prediction in that previous video, the round 4 video, was I believe Bilibili in 4. I could be right or wrong on that. I know I picked Bilibili, but I don't remember the exact number that I gave. It could be 4, it could be 3, it could be 5. I know I picked Bilibili to win though, and I think a lot of people are going to be looking at them as pretty heavy favorites, not because Top Esports is bad, but rather that Bilibili is very likely at worst a top 2 team in the entire world at any given moment. Their mechanical ceiling is just higher than every other team in the entire world, in my opinion. It is going to be almost impossible to go toe-to-toe with them in the early game, and I think that just generates so many natural leads for them that series end up getting out of control so quickly. They were pretty good against Ninjas in Pyjamas, but if you are looking for a flaw, they didn't exactly dominate in a way that maybe you would have liked to see. Obviously, we now know that Ninjas in Pyjamas is actually a genuinely good team, and losing a game to them isn't exactly the worst thing in the world, but I think a lot of people expected BLG to come into the playoffs and just utterly dominate. That didn't quite happen, but I still have a lot of faith in them for Top Esports. They did utterly dominate. They swept JD Gaming, who is now sitting in the semifinals awaiting the loser of this series, and, you know, for you've generated so much confidence and so much momentum out of this series that, you know, maybe you're going to be going into this feeling good about your chances. Not that you ever come into a series like this thinking you can lose it, but rather, like, I think there is a lot more confidence on Top Esports than there would have been had that previous series gone a different way. So I think this is really exciting. Again, Bilibili are favorites for me, but I don't think it's nearly as much as what I was talking about when it came to JDG and Ninjas in Pyjamas. JDG were heavy favorites in that series. It would have been a pretty big upset if they had lost, and I don't think there is a case for that here. I think Bilibili are favorites, but I don't think people would be stunned if Top Esports end up winning this series and making finals, especially after what they showed in round 4. But of course, we have to see what happens in a game-by-game fashion, and that means starting with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and they establish their dominance early in this one. Just a really, really dominant game from them overall. I think the biggest concern would be that they could potentially come out in this game and not look nearly as dominant as maybe one would hope, because that's not what they were against Ninjas in Pyjamas. They were just good. They weren't exactly like blowing the roof off, but you know what? Let's go play a full lockdown team. Let's play Vi. Let's play Ori. Let's play Camille, and we'll just jump on this R1 Draven over and over and over again. I have never seen a pick get punished so much in draft, and it was punished in game as well. Trust me, this was just not a particularly fun game to be playing an immobile AD carry that wants to do a lot of damage. Draven really didn't have a lot of hope to survive in this one, and lucky for BLG, they were able to capitalize a lot on it. Player of the game, I think, in broadcast ended up going to On. I think that's relatively fine. The Camille was very impactful in this game, and we're seeing a rise in Camille support. Obviously, this champion has received some buffs over the course of the last few weeks, and it has made her stronger, but I don't really think that's enough to justify how well On played. Like, I certainly think that he made a lot of really good plays in this game that weren't just the champion being really strong, but I think B4 Camille here is a very valuable pick. You have a lot of things that you can lock down that are relatively low mobility, and it does kind of cut off a lot of the things that are high mobility on this team as well. You've got Lee Sin, you've got Talia. I mean, if you ult Talia, she can't engage in the same kind of way that she could before, and so, you know, I think the Camille does have a lot of options here, but mostly this is here to destroy the Draven, and man, did it accomplish its goal. But I'm going to give player of the game personally to Elk. I think he was the most important member of the team in this game. I think if the Kalista wasn't following up on a lot of the things that the Camille or the Orianna or the Vi were doing, I think this game becomes significantly harder. And also, Elk's positioning is just so good in so many of these fights. He was never giving openings for the enemy team to come back in this game at all. Draven just needs one big cash out in order to be relevant in a game like this, and Elk was in such a good spot to never give that cash out over. Sometimes it can be relatively risky playing Kalista into Draven. That's why Draven was the counter pick early on in this draft, is because Kalista, known for dominating lane, actually struggles against the raw power that Draven offers. She can't really play nearly as aggressive, but when Elk is playing on the edge of danger, when his positioning is as solid, as perfect as it was in this game, it becomes so much easier for players like On or Shun or Knight to end up playing out this game. And I think that's one of the big things that I've celebrated Bilibili for, is that all of them being so good, they don't hamper each other in that way. They make each other better in that way because it just opens up more avenues for other members of this team who are also ridiculously talented to then go and make these super aggressive plays because you don't have to worry about the other players on this team making a mistake. I've talked about it a lot with Knight. It was a reason why I gave him my MVP award, is because it becomes so much easier to play jungle or bot lane or even top lane to an extent when you constantly have mid lane pressure, when you are constantly ahead in terms of the resources and advantages you have. It just makes the game so much easier to play out. But the same can be said for basically anybody generating their own individual lead. It just makes everybody's life a lot easier on the team, and I think Elk and On were a big part of why everybody else had such a good game. Knight was also excellent. I very much considered him for player of the game in that same vein. He was awesome on Orianna. Cream had a pretty good game on the other side of this, was very aggro, was certainly trying to keep up. We'll credit Tian and Cream because I think both of them played well here, or at least as well as they could in game number 1, but Knight was excellent on the Orianna. Again, never really putting himself in danger, but stepping up when he needs to step up. He knows that Orianna can be a pretty big playmaker, and especially for a low mobility Draven, you hit one shockwave and the big team fight is now over. So really big credit to Knight. Bin was excellent. June was really good, constantly just diving in alongside the Camille. You have so much dive onto the backline here, especially for these low mobility carries, that it's basically impossible for TES to play the game. So credit to Bilibili, really like how they ended up playing here. But for top esports, unfortunately, I think you lost in draft. Like, I don't think it's that simple. I think that there were avenues to be able to come back in this game, and I think Tian and Cream kind of showed that off because they were fine for the most part in this game, but relying on Thresh on R5 to try and save this Draven from the Vi, from Ori Shockwave, from even Kalista Ultimate, or Rek'Sai ult, or especially Camille ult, it's just not a particularly, successful way to do things, especially for things like the Camille ult. You can't actually save the Draven. You can't lantern the Draven out of Camille Ultimate, and so it ends up becoming very difficult to end up having the Thresh be useful, and Jackie Love paid the price for it. He's going to get done of the game because he could do nothing in this one. We talk about the bot lane being much improved for top esports because Mako coming in has really solidified what they're able to do in the early game. He's a big roamer. Jackie Love is very capable of playing the 1v2 very successfully and generating his own resources, but when this team does want to index early into the bot lane, when they want to get this big counter pick, allow Jackie to try and snowball the game out of control on something like Draven, you need to be able to help him out, and he really had no help in this game. It's hard for me to really, point the blame at Jackie Love in particular, because really what was he supposed to do in this game? But he was useless, and it was probably the biggest reason why this team ended up losing. Like I said, Cream, Tian, I think were generally fine. They were trying to go out there and make plays. They were at least staying active on the map. I think when you're going to go for like a Lee Sin, Taliyah early game, then it is good to be active. It is good to go out there and try to make plays. Tian in particular, I thought had a pretty good game. It just didn't end up mattering. Bot lane lost a little bit too hard. The Thresh was not useful. This is kind of the downside of that champion, and the Draven was certainly not useful. Ornn was irrelevant on the top side because they never got to the late game where that champion could actually do any sort of damage, and so TES ended up losing it, and losing it pretty convincingly. It is kind of a weird game number 1. I'm not really sure how this projects onto the rest of the series, but, credit to Bilibili for understanding what TES's losing condition is and really capitalizing on that over and over again. But game 2 just has to be a bit of a different game plan, and honestly, it will be. There is no way that both of these teams get this again. Bilibili was just in such a commanding position from draft, but game 2 is really going to show us, I think, a lot more. This was essentially a free 1-0 start for BLG. How does TES respond? Can they bounce back and even up the series at 1 apiece, or is Bilibili going to take that win and run with it with a commanding 2-0 lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and we've got ourselves a series, everyone. This is going to be fun, and I really do like how TES played out this game number 2. It's a complete switch up from them in draft. They don't want to go for these risky low mobility picks. They want to go for things that they feel a lot more comfortable pulling off right now, and this is kind of the formula that I've talked about a lot on this channel. I talked about it in the previous series that I think is super successful right now. Tank jungle that's going to be consistent at contesting objectives in the mid to late game. A mid laner who can either team fight or alternatively can be really aggro in the early game. So whether you want it to be in a Azir or a Tristana or whatever, right? Whatever avenue you want to go there, I think you just have to index somewhere. Taliyah obviously does a bit of both, but it's really hard to get Taliyah in the current meta, so Azir works just fine. And then if you're going to go for Azir, early game AD carry, something that can be really forceful, can push a lot of tempo, can really take a lot of these skirmishes so they can develop, tempo there rather than through the middle of the map. That's the exact formula that I think has worked. I think the Maokai is probably the most important part of the formula for me, and it's shocking that this champion has fallen off in terms of priority, in my opinion, because of just how much it does. But whether you want to have an early game mid laner and a late game AD carry, or an early game AD carry and a late game mid laner, whatever you want to end up doing, I think you can pull that off. But this worked really well for TES. They had control of most of this game. BLG did keep it close because they're very talented and they have a lot of things, and they clearly are trying to get the advantage in the bot lane in draft. That's clearly where they want to put a lot of their resources. They know the top esports like to pick it early, and so when they see B1 Lucian, they know that they can pretty comfortably pick this Caitlyn Lux. It just didn't end up working out in the way that I think they wanted it to. They were able to establish a small lead, but that Lucian was still crazy relevant throughout a lot of this game, and he's going to get player of the game. Jackie Love, that is on the Lucian. Really played this well. I think it can be kind of hard sometimes to play Lucian into these matchups. It's why they went for the Caitlyn Lux, because you really want to try and push the advantage in the mid game. Luckily for Lucian, Caitlyn really struggles at being able to do that. The mid game's not exactly her big break point. I think she's really great, like levels 1 to 5 around about. Like obviously her 6 is still strong too, but especially in the current meta, I think obviously the 2v2 is a very big positive for her, especially paired up with Lux. But when you get to these 3v3, 4v4 skirmishes, she's really not all that strong. She really reappears, I would say, when she gets to 3 or 4 items. That's when she becomes like a really dangerous carry in some of these fights. But when you're at 1, 2 items, Lucian actually does kind of have the advantage in terms of the pressure he can put on, maybe outside of lane, like in these skirmishes. And man, Jackie Love did a great job of applying that pressure. You need somebody to duck in and out of fights, to be aggressive, to try to play off of this Maokai who can frontline really well for you. Jackie Love is the exact kind of player who can execute that at a high level. And so, respect to Bilibili for understanding that they need to put a lot of time and effort into getting this bot lane into a bad position. The problem is this bot lane's just too good. Mako was also very good on the Nami. I talk about this a lot. I know Nami can kind of fade into the background when it comes to these lanes because you don't really see the kind of highlight plays that you do on the Lucian, but Nami is just as integral as to why this lane ends up working, and both of them had to play well, and Mako did play well here, but Jackie Love was definitely kind of the star here. Big credit to the top side as well. 369 was very good on the Urgot. I know that there was a meme about, 369 would never pick Urgot in a pivotal playoff game. Well, here we are. Urgot's been picked basically everywhere else. It was about time one of the better top laners in the LPL ended up selecting it, and so not shocking to see it come out here. It's not really been all that successful globally. Like, it's kind of just been fine. It's just been an okay pick, but it was really good in this game because 369 is really good. And Tion, I thought, was excellent here, was definitely the better jungler. When you're playing like a tank jungler into something like Xin Zhao, which has become a very common matchup in the current meta, you just need to wait it out. You need to make sure that the Xin Zhao on the other side of the map can't actually apply as much pressure as he would like in every single engage. That is the problem that sometimes Maokai can run into, is that he is a little bit slower. But if you're getting to the mid game and you're relatively even, or more specifically, if you're getting to the mid game and Xin Zhao's not super far ahead and doesn't really have all these resources and hasn't controlled every single objective, then you've done a great job and you're almost certainly going to be significantly more useful than him for the entirety of the rest of the game. And that's what Tion did. Very, very good pacing from him. The only concern was Cream. Got caught out way too often and really was in some bad positions. BLG clearly wanted to put some of their effort into the mid lane. Knight was very good this game on the Vygar. It just wasn't enough to be able to capitalize on. Jackie Love and Mako were excellent. Tion and 369 I thought had a really good game, and overall TES got the win because of it. For Bilibili on the other side of this matchup, again, I understand the idea of indexing super hard into trying to snowball this game out of control. Xin Zhao plus Caitlyn plus Lux is very much like, we want to win this game by 5 to 7 minutes. We want to invest a lot into making sure that Lucian can't play the game, Maokai can't play the game. Those are the things that we want to shut off. And even to an extent, like the Rek'Sai kind of fits into that in the top side, but they just weren't able to push that advantage hard enough. It's such a small window for them to be able to capitalize on, and you really are only relying on potentially getting into that like 35, 40-minute game, 3+ items for the Vygar and the Caitlyn to be more relevant in a 5v5 that, once things started to spiral out of control around 25 minutes into the game, they didn't really have a lot of avenues to get back in unless there were major mistakes from top esports, and they're just too good of a team to make those major mistakes. And so where do I want to put the blame? Well, I'm going to put it mostly on June for this game. I think if you're playing this comp, you have to go balls to the wall. Like, you have to play it as if you're going to guarantee lose the game after 15 minutes if you don't have a massive lead. That is the only way, in my opinion, that you can play this if you are Xin Zhao, and I just think he wasn't aggressive enough. I know that's crazy to say, but I think if he had pushed the tempo a bit more, if he had taken more risks, perhaps even like losing his own life in favor of getting Vygar or Caitlyn accelerated a tad bit faster, even the Rek'Sai a tad bit faster, I think this game could potentially go in a different direction. BLG really wasn't all that far behind for a lot of it, but June simply had to be better. His team fighting was also horrible in the back half of the game, but that's more Xin Xin Zhao than it is Jun, in my opinion. Like I said, if you're looking for positives, I thought Knight was really good in this game on the Vigar. Just what are you supposed to do as that champion if you're trying to 1v9? It's not exactly the champion that can do that at the easiest level. I understand the idea behind Caitlyn Lux, but I do think they're a bit underpowered. Caitlyn in particular just doesn't have the same kind of combat power right now that she did last year, and so you're going to find it kind of difficult to push that advantage nearly as hard as you would have, and Bin, I guess, was generally fine on the top side, but I think Top Esports, again, outplayed and outdrafted and out-macroed, out-executed Bilibili in this game, which is really good to see. This is a fun series so far, and Top Esports has certainly shown up to play. Bilibili does have to answer back, or else, you know, if they go down 2-1 here, like, game 1 was very weird, the draft was very weird. Game 2, they didn't look nearly as cohesive, nearly as good. Now we're at an even best of 3, and so whoever wins this game 3, as you guys know, to me, is really in a good position. Having to win both of the final 2 games is going to be so difficult against either of these teams that I think game 3 really will determine a lot. But who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to retake control of this series by going up 2-1, and Blue Side continues to look incredibly overpowered in a matchup between two teams that are even remotely similar in skill level. I don't want to chalk it all up to Blue Side, but this was the most dominating game of the series, and so I have to talk about something for 5 minutes, because I don't know if I can talk about the gameplay for the entirety of those 5 minutes. This went 37 minutes, and I can't believe it took them that long to end the game. Credit to Top Esports. They did their best to try and delay this game. Mako had the most kills on the team as Nami. That is never a particularly good sign, but Bilibili just absolutely eviscerated them here in game 3. This is the kind of BLG that I wanted to see show up in a series like this. Not that I wanted it to not be close, but rather I want to see a team like BLG really just be the best team in the world. I want to see the upside and the potential of this team to decimate everybody that they go up against. The fact that they can do this in a game against Top Esports, who is very competitive, who has 5 really good players on the team, it just goes to show how good BLG are. I'm not saying we should get this every single game, but the fact that it's in there, I think, is impressive enough on its own. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Elk. I don't know how you could give it to anybody else. This is how you play Kalista. I loved his Kalista game in game number 1. You know, I really praised him for that. I think a lot of people put a lot of attention on in that game. To me, it was Elk capitalizing on the things that On was creating that really made it so difficult for Top Esports to even stay in the game. In this one, B1, Kalista, understanding the assignment, understanding that if you can dominate the laning phase, you're probably just going to end up doing really well in that game, and Elk is just so clinical on this champion. It truly does at times feel a little bit unfair to see people have to go into it. Jackie Love and Mako are not pushovers, but man, did they feel like it. He is simply just so good at this champion, and obviously credit to Jun and credit to On, who I think both did a phenomenal job of facilitating this gameplay from Elk, but Elk still had to be the one to capitalize on it. He was doing so much damage in these fights. He could just jump around everywhere and be essentially invulnerable. So credit to Elk. He was excellent. On continues to look amazing. This bot lane has looked very good in this series up until this point. Jackie Love and Mako did a great job to bounce back in game number 2. The Caitlyn Lux didn't exactly work for Elk and On in the way that they maybe intended, but I don't think they made any egregious errors. But games 1, 3, I think you could definitely look at that as the bot lane just straight up winning the game for Bilibili, and that is a really positive thing to say. They've been the best bot lane in the LPL, in my opinion, by a pretty large margin, and to me, I don't think this is all that controversial of a statement. They are pretty clearly the best bot lane in the world at the current moment, especially with how they've played in this series. Not that the LCK bot lanes are bad by any means. I love Viper and Delight. You know, I love Gumayushi and Keria. I love Pays and Lahens. But I think Elk and On have them beat right now in terms of the performances they are putting out. I really do think that not only are they the best bot lane in the LPL, but probably in the world. And this was just another great example of that. For the rest of the team, Jun was excellent on the Wukong. This is a champion that really is kind of an LPL special. A lot of the LPL junglers really like to play Wukong, and it's pretty easy to see why. Not only does he have a relatively good early game, but he is a phenomenal team fighter. He's still one of the best team fighting junglers in the game, you know, right up there with the other tanks. He's just probably the more aggressive version of that engaged style. And I think there's really not a huge substitute for Wukong in the current meta, and so I really like seeing him continue to come out. Of course, this region plays him more than others, but Jun was excellent, controlling the pressure early, and Tian had a miserable game on the Lee Sin. That's one of those champions where if you fall behind, it is really tough to get back in the game, and even with something like a Corki, like this team is not built to win these 5v5s. They are just not set up in that way, and so credit to Jun. He was in a really good spot, and his champion definitely was better towards the end of the game. Bin was near perfect in this, just didn't really have to do a whole ton on the Renekton. The team kind of won without him. Not that he was bad in any way. He destroyed the Quinn in the 1v1, just he didn't really have to win in order for this team to be relevant. And Knight was definitely getting himself into, I would say, the most trouble. I still think he was fine this game, but he Corki could have stood to be a little bit better, and that's crazy. Like, if Knight's the weak link, this team is going to win Worlds without dropping a single game. Like, the performance they put out here is genuinely unbelievable. Everybody on the team was excellent, and Bilibili really showed, I think, their upside in this Game 3. But for Top Esports, it's kind of unfortunate to win Game 2, to feel pretty good about the series, and then to kind of get trounced in a pretty pivotal Game number 3. I don't really love this draft. You are indexing pretty early on into, like, momentum and trying to get prio, but you draft Corki. Again, I want to reiterate, there are certain champions that I think are so overvalued by Pro that I just don't really understand, like, why. I don't understand why people are picking them. I don't understand why they have the priority that they do. Vi is one of those champions pretty notoriously for me on this channel. The other one, Corki, I just don't get it. Like, I don't get what this champion does that you don't get out of other safer, more reliable picks, and I really don't see it in this game in particular. You are heavily lacking any sort of, like, actual consistency on this team. Lucian, Nami, they can do really well in the mid game, and they're generally going to be strong there, but that's really their power spike, and especially into, like, Kalista. Like, I get the idea of it. You want to try and take her out in fights early, but if she gets fed, all of a sudden Lucian, Nami can't play the game. Same thing for Lee Sin. He's so reliant on snowballing. Same thing for Quinn, so reliant on snowballing. I get this idea that Corki is some late game hyper carry that will always be relevant, but the truth of the matter is that Corki actually diminishes your early game in order to make his late game stronger, and I think that actually takes away from the advantages that, you know, picks like Lee Sin or Lucian end up offering. He can't be there for any of these skirmishes. He's not going to be relevant for a lot of this game, and so by the time Corki is theoretically relevant, all of the other champions on your team have scaled out of their power spikes, and now it's like, oh, well, Corki's going to save us now that he's strong. No, he can't 1v9. He's not the kind of champion that can do that, and so I really don't understand the idea, not only of Corki in the meta, but specifically Corki on a team like this. I really think it loses the plot, and I'm really out on the pick just in general, but it wasn't just Cream. He's not even dead of the game. Tion is going to get dead of the game. One of the worst Lee Sin performances we have seen in a long time. I'm a fan of Tion. I'm a big defender of Tion, but this is not super defendable. This was just not a good look, I would say, from a good player. Jackie Love and Mako got run over in the bot lane. That Kalista got fed way too fast, and they got dominated in the 2v2, and Quinn, I mean, I get it, like, but this is a pretty pivotal game number 3. I don't think this is the situation I'm busting the Quinn out in. Again, a pretty classic LPL pick, but it did not work out. A pretty classic counter to Renekton, I'll say as well, but it did not work out. So overall, Top Esports looking bad in this game, and they're going to have to turn around their form entirely if they want to stay alive in this series. Bilibili is one game away from moving on to MSI, from moving on to the finals. Can they close it out here in 4, or is Top Esports going to push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Top Esports. We are going to a game number 5. They are able to win this game 4 in pretty good fashion as well, kind of counteracting what Bilibili was able to do in game number 3. They went to a much more standard comp. Yes, very aggressive, but aggressive was never the problem with Top Esports. Yes, they've slowed down, I would say, in 2024 compared to some of the other teams they've had in the past, but a lot of that has been controlled chaos, and I think that really plays into the strengths of a lot of these players. I think the tried and true, the patented Maokai Tristana mid-jungle duo that has brought basically every single team that has tried its success across the playoffs, whether that be in round 1 all the way here to round 5. It doesn't really matter who's playing it. Basically, everybody who's played it has won their games. It's tried and true, and it works for a reason. This is a great duo because they offer each other exactly what they want, and I'll get to that when we talk about this a little bit more in depth. But for Bilibili, I don't hate their idea here. You're going for a lot more of a team fight approach. You still have the Rek'Sai and the Rel to potentially be more aggressive in the early game. The Kindred wants to scale out of control. We know June's very good at Kindred. This has always been a signature pick of his alongside the Nidalee. They just didn't have enough pressure to actually be able to finish the game. So while they were relevant at times, you had a Jinx, you had Nazir that both had gold and were online and were able to fight. You had no other way to facilitate them because the Rel was very weak. The Rek'Sai got destroyed in the top lane, and June was also losing a lot of pressure throughout the map because Maokai is really, really difficult to deal with in the current meta. We will talk about it, but for Top Esports, player of the game pretty obviously is going to go to Cream. He's really not been all that good in this series. I think he's been fine generally. Like, game 2 was solid, but games 1 and 3, I was really not a big fan of not only the way he played, but the way he indexed himself in draft. Whether you want to blame that on him or blame it on the coaching staff, I think is really up to you, up to your personal interpretation of it, but finally getting a champion that has priority in the early game into a matchup that I think is really positive for him, he was able to do a lot of damage. Triss really fits his playstyle of wanting to be a bit more aggressive in the early game. He's never been a player that I would necessarily see as a Corki player, somebody who wants to sit back and kind of wait for his time to come. Give him a playmaker, give him something he can be really aggro and macro-oriented on. He's always been very good at assassins. It's always kind of been his signature thing, and so So Tristana does kind of fill that niche, and Trist to me is still the second best mid laner in the game. I know that might be a bit of a controversial opinion, especially because she's certainly not number 2 in terms of like pick rate or pick ban percentage, but every single time this champion is played, it just wins. Like, it just dominates, and I understand that it takes a certain team comp around her in order to facilitate it, but the comp's not that hard, man. Like, Gragas, Maokai, yeah, that's enough. Maokai is super undervalued, in my opinion, in terms of how good he is in comparison to his pick ban rate. For my money, he is the most consistent jungler in the game right now, and I think pairing these two up, there's a reason they have like an 85% win rate as a duo in the playoffs so far. It's because when you get these two together, not only do you have that early priority out of the middle of the map, which I always talk about on this channel as being the most important thing in the game right now, but you also have the stability of being able to control objectives. I really do think that this is like a game-breaking jungle mid duo, and it stuns me that teams are not indexing into it more. I really do think it's that strong, but especially if you're going to pair it with something like Draven, that's going to pull enough attention on its own down in the bot lane. That leaves so much space and so much opportunity to get the Trist moving around the map, to make plays essentially wherever you want it, and then you can have 3v3 or 4v4 skirmishes basically anywhere you want in any group of players. Like, you can do 3v3 on the top side with Gragas, Maokai, Tristana. You're absolutely going to win that against Rek'Sai, Kindred, and Azir. You could have a 4v4 with Maokai, Trist, Draven, and Nautilus against the bot side of the map for Bilibili. You are absolutely going to win that because you have no answer to Nautilus, Hook, plus Draven. And Maokai is really going to help there as well. You control every objective. It's just a great draft, in my opinion. Probably the most cohesive of the entire series from both of these teams. And Cream still had to go out there and execute. The Tristana is vital in these games, but it does open up a pathway for the Trist to basically, you know, execute on the things that we know these players can execute on. This was great for Cream and great as a draft, in my opinion. Tion did a great job on the Maokai, super integral to this comp and making sure that it functions correctly, making sure to enable both the Trist and the Draven. You have to split your time well, and you have to be very stable in the late game, but that's what Tion was for this team. Jackie, Love, and Mako, I thought, had a much better game here than they did in game number 3, or hell, even game number 1, where Jackie Love was legit not allowed to play at all on the Draven. I just think overall this was a much more cohesive idea and draft from Top Esports, and they executed it just about as well as you possibly could ask for. But for Bilibili on the other side, this is a bit concerning. It does feel like, you know, going into a game number 5, anything can kind of happen. This has been a crazy series, a very fun one up until this point, but there were some moments where you just lost pressure in areas that you probably shouldn't have in this game. Credit to Knight and Elk. They did fine as carries, but they don't really have the initiation tools in order to salvage this game when the enemy team has so much damage. You really are relying on your secondary pieces, your ancillary pieces on this team in order to make this comp work, in order to enable the Azir, to enable the Jinx who do have gold. And unfortunately, those pieces just weren't all that relevant. The R5 Kindred, while in theory, I do like the idea because, again, if you get that Kindred snowballing, this game is instantly over. It really is an auto-win condition against this comp for Top Esports. The unfortunate part is you just never really had the opportunity to do so. You couldn't actually win any skirmishes because Tristana was everywhere on the map, and Trist is going to blow up that Kindred so fast, especially before 4 stacks. And then Rek'Sai ended up losing on the top side. I don't think Bin had a particularly good game at all in this one. Rek'Sai should theoretically have at least some prio into Gragas. Maybe not as much as you would into some of the more obvious meta matchups, but I still think Rek'Sai can do something there, and I don't think Bin had a particularly good game, but dud of the game for me is going to go to On. When you engage on Rel, it has to be purposeful. You can't go in with the expectation that your team is just going to follow up. It has to be with the design of catching someone out, and it really didn't feel like On was all that controlled about the chaos in this game. I talked about that with Top Esports. They excel in these controlled chaos scenarios. I think On tried to match some of the aggression that Top Esports was showing, and I just don't think the rest of the team was ready to do that. When you're playing Azir plus Jinx, you're not really in a situation where around 15 minutes, you can really afford to do that. Now, some of those engages did end up working out. I'm not going to sit here and say that everything On did this game was bad. I certainly do think that there were some good moments, but I think a lot of them were also kind of bad. And Rel is also one of those champions that is really bad from behind. She's just not good from states where you go in and you don't have the damage to follow up on Rel engages, and so it just wasn't a great situation for BLG overall, and now we're going to a Silver Scrapes Game 5. It's the second time in this video, but this is a huge game. This is winner take all. The winner of this one game will be heading to MSI, will be heading to the finals. The loser has to head down into the lower bracket and take on a JD Gaming team that is certainly not a pushover by any means. This is a must-win for both of these teams in order to confirm their spot where they want to be, but who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Bilibili Gaming. They are gonna take game number 5. They are going to qualify for the LPL finals and also qualify for the mid-season invitational. What a banger. I'm hopped up on energy just talking about this game. It truly was ridiculous. You can see a giant goal difference. You can see, they were leading in kills. Their score lines look way better. This looks like a blowout. Do not look at the numbers on this screen and assume that this was a blowout. It took a backdoor. We got an Xpeke, baby. We did it. It's been years since we finally seen one in such a high-pressure situation as this, but with the LPL finals, with an MSI trip on the line, Bin on this Twisted Fate, gets into the base, gets the Nexus, an absolute banger way to end a pretty banger series. This was a really good 5-game set between these two teams, and honestly, it just makes me want to see it again in the finals. We'll talk about Top Esports. They head now down to the lower bracket, which is obviously unfortunate. They get their rematch with JD Gaming, who they decimated last time around. Obviously, that means they have quite a bit of confidence and momentum going into that series. However, it's not guaranteed that they're going to be able to do the same thing again. JDG is going to be ready this time. They are going to be hopped up, and they certainly are going to want to avenge that loss. So, a really interesting timeline, a really interesting turn of events, but let's talk about this Game 5 player of the game. It has to go to Bin. He solo won the game. How does it go to anybody else? I can sit here and say all these things, but Bin, first of all, was still super relevant in this game. He's really good at Twisted Fate, and it's the first time he's ever played it professionally, which almost seems a bit unfair. Obviously, I'm sure he's practiced it. I'm sure he's played it quite a bit in scrims, but for this being his first stage game on the champion, quite a time to pull it out and quite a time for it to work as well as it did. So credit to Bin. His team fighting was exceptional in this game. That champion surprisingly does a lot of damage. I know he's not known for just bursting people down instantly, but he can really hurt if you give him the opportunity to just blow you up in a fight, or if he gets on a priority target like the Varus throughout the fight or the Azir. He can do a lot, and Bin was really successful at that in this game. So credit to him. Was everywhere he needed to be on the map. And oh yeah, did I mention he single-handedly won the game with a backdoor? So yeah, he's player of the game. I would be remiss to not mention the biggest play of the game, though. I know we can talk about the backdoor, but a ridiculous flash shove by Knight on the Talia onto the fed Varus on the other side that essentially won them a pretty massive team fight in this game. That was the biggest play of the game. I think Knight played excellently here on the Talia. The champion continues to baffle me that it continues to get through draft, and to get to B2, to get through not only B1, but R1, R2, to pick Azir over Talia, to me, it's just crazy. I get that Cream's good on Azir, but leaving Talia up for someone like Knight, who's super proactive, who is very much willing to go out there and make a play on his own, I just think it was a recipe for disaster, and Knight absolutely made them pay in a big way for this. So credit to Knight. He was excellent throughout a lot of this series, but player of the series as a whole for me, maybe not shockingly, is going to go to Elk in the bot lane. I feel like when you're talking about consistency, game 1, game 3, they really stood out for me. And honestly, the only game that he really was off in was game number 4. I think game 2 was a little up in the air, and he wasn't perfect here in game 5, but I think for the most part, he was the most valuable player on this team throughout this series, and I continue to be very high on Elk. He has a really strong case to be made right now that he is the best AD carry in the world. He's certainly in the conversation. Like I said earlier, I truly do believe Bilibili has the best bot lane in the world as a grand total, but whether or not you want to put him up against players like Viper or a player like Ruler, who he kind of has been better than over the course of this year, I think is really up to you. I think Elk has certainly put himself in the conversation, which I think is a credit in its own right. Those two players have a ridiculous track record, and Elk, I think, obviously doesn't have the same kind of longevity that they have, but his performances over the past year and a half have been worthy of being considered in that conversation. So Elk really showing up on this stage here and really being a pivotal force for Bilibili. It's massive for this team. On was excellent. You can't give him Rakan, man. He's simply too good at these champions, especially with Mako on something like Thresh on the other side that just doesn't have the same kind of playmaking potential in the current kit. It felt unfair in some of these fights. June was fine. Maybe could have stood to be a little bit more proactive throughout this game, but Bin, Knight definitely had them covered. Twisted Fate plus Talia comps are very difficult to deal with, so credit to Bilibili. They knew their win condition, which was get into the base. Once they got in there, Twisted Fate could finish the job, but credit to Knight. I think he won this game with that seismic shove. Credit to Elk and On, who were excellent throughout this series, and June was along for the ride as well. I don't think it was horrible by any means, and so credit to Bilibili. Just a really good series overall, and you can't take anything away from Top Esports, who absolutely tried their darndest in this series. Game 2, Game 4, both were very strong, and honestly, they had an opportunity here in game number 5 5 to end up taking it. Jackie Love just got caught in a pretty pivotal situation, which is unfortunate. Big game performer Jackie Love. You know, it's going to happen every once in a while when you're as aggressive, when you play on the edge of danger. Sometimes a flash seismic shove from one of the best players in the world is going to catch you out, and you're not going to be able to react in time, and it is what it is, but Jackie Love was the reason they were in that game anyway, so it's hard to really criticize him. Him and Mako, I thought, had a relatively good game. I think you could even make the argument they were better than Elkanon for parts of this game. I'm not going to make that argument. I think both bot lanes were actually very solid, and both did a lot of really good things for their teams, but dud of the game, unfortunately, is going to go to 369, allowing Bin to get really strong, not really having a huge impact on the team fights, and then eventually, of course, his lane opponent ending the game. It's really not ideal. It's not a great situation for them to be in, but, you know, again, I don't want to dwell on the negatives. I think that's really where I want to stand on this. I don't want to dwell on the things that went wrong for Top Esports. They played Bilibili Gaming, who very well might be the best team in the entire world, incredibly tough, and this comes just a couple of days after they swept JD Gaming out of the upper bracket. This is a damn good team, and honestly, in the way that they're playing right now, this feels like a top 2 team in the LPL. I'm not going to sit here and tell you what my prediction is going to be going into that series, but they proved a lot here, and if my prediction in my full bracket, which was Top Esports winning the first matchup, JD Gaming winning the second matchup, you know, in that, I had JDG end up winning that second matchup because, you know, I assumed Top Esports was going to lose to Bilibili, lose a bit of confidence and come into the series playing a little bit differently. JDG always adapts pretty well, but it's not really happened. I don't really see a loss in momentum for Top Esports here. You played Bilibili essentially to the last moment, and you really had an opportunity to take this series and to go to MSI. Just because you didn't win it, I don't think it should be any sort of indictment on this team, and you dominated JDG. And then for JDG's sake, we'll talk about it later, but it's not like they took care of Ninjas in Pyjamas in a dominant, clear way. This is, you know, a strong Top Esports team, and I think they're going to feel pretty confident going into the next couple of rounds, but they are going to have to take care of that. Bilibili is not, though. They are in the finals. They are in MSI. They are one series away from being LPL champions for the first time in this organization's history. They've spent so much money, so much resources over the course of their history to try to get a team that could make it here. They finally have a group of 5 players that might be able to consider themselves the best in the world, and truly, I do think they've earned it every step of the way. But now that we've covered our 2 series that we had in lower bracket round number 4, and of course round 5, which was winners finals, it's time to get into previewing our semifinals. The winner of this series qualifies for MSI, qualifies for the LPL finals, and gets to take on Bilibili Gaming for a shot at being the LPL champion. It's of course a matchup between the number 2 seeded Top Esports and the number 3 seeded JD Gaming, and we've already seen this. I would go into more detail, like I'll talk about it, obviously. I'll talk about the matchups and where I think these players are landing, but I've already previewed this series in this exact kind of format in a previous round. I talked about it obviously before their round 4 matchup, so you can check out the round 3 video that I have on my channel if you want an in-depth breakdown of where I think each of these players stack up in terms of where they're currently playing, and honestly, less has changed since then than I would have expected. JDG is still in this kind of flux state where I trust a couple of these players a lot and don't trust a couple of these players as much as I thought I would, and Top Esports is in a state where I actually really believe in them right now. And so, as you can see from the percentile graph in the middle of the screen with the 2 colors, I'm actually favoring Top Esports very slightly here. I still think this is going to be close. I think JDG still has yet to show us the best version of this team, and I still think that version of them is there. I think it's just kind of waiting to get out, and it's just not been there on the stage recently, but any given game, any given series, I think they could show up, and Ruler and Missing could completely pop off like they were doing all of last year. I think Kanavi and Yagao could really enable each other in order to play their best league, and we've seen what Flandre can do at his absolute best. We just haven't seen all of that come together for one game or one series over the course of this playoff run, and I think that's really what's been disappointing, is that there's flashes of this team being the team that we know they can be. They just have not been able to consistently put it together. On the flip side of that, Top Esports has been able to put it together. Basically, everybody has stepped it up in this playoff run. I think 369 has been excellent. Jackie Love and Mako have been phenomenal, and you could definitely argue that they should be favorites as the bot lane in this series, almost purely because they've been so good. And even Cream, I think, has played excellent throughout this playoff run, somebody who I really doubted in terms of whether or not he could step up and be like this elite piece for a top-tier team in the LPL right now. Well, he's been exactly that on a variety of different picks. He has been excellent. Somebody who's obviously a former channel darling from his time on OMG back in like 2021, all the way back then. So You know, I'm a big fan of where Top Esports is right now. If you're looking for flaws in this team, it's that some of these players are a little bit inconsistent. We saw it in that series. Tion can have a bad game every once in a while, and Kanavi's certainly the kind of jungler that can take advantage of having a bad performance or a bad series. He has immaculate pathing, and so if you get into these situations where pathing becomes a bit more of a problem, then Kanavi could actually be just winning the series on his own. Outside of that, I don't think 369 has been unbeatable. We saw him towards the end of that series not have perfect games, and Flandre has been known to take advantage of some mistakes. But outside of that, like, you're really just hoping that JD Gaming's individual players can live up to their potential. Ruler and Missing simply have to be better. There is no more excuses. Yagao was pretty good in their previous playoff series against NIP and has to be good for the rest of these playoffs as well. Kanavi has to live up to being the best jungler in the world. Flandre has to keep a hot streak going and has to be able to do it from game to game and not have these weird off games sprinkled in like he did against Top Esports the last time these two played. It really is going to be up to, in my opinion, which version of JD Gaming shows up. I think if you get the best version of this team, they're going to win this series, and if you don't, they're going to lose this series, as we saw previously with them getting swept by Top Esports. I think there's a lot of confidence going into this from TES. I think there is a lot of things to prove, a vengeance storyline for JD Gaming. I could see this going both ways in terms of storyline. I'm going to very slightly favor TES because on tape it's just not a question, but the reason that it's not more than this, the reason that, you know, if you were just looking at the tape, Top Esports would be like an 80-20, maybe even more than that, favorite in this series, because I think they've been significantly better in terms of their playoff run so far. The reason that they are not is because they are facing JD Gaming, who seems to always figure it out in these big moments, but both of these teams are going to feel very hard done if they lose this and miss MSI. Unfortunately, one of them is going to be in that negative spot. I just don't really know or feel super confident as to who that's going to be. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Round 5 overview and analysis video here in the spring playoffs. Final 3 is locked in. We know the 3 teams that are going to, at the very least, compete for a shot to go international. Bilibili confirming their spot at MSI with a win in the winners finals. Top Esports and JD Gaming will face off this weekend to determine which team will be joining them. I cannot wait for that series. I know you guys are excited, and if you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What do you think is going to happen? Who do you have, Top Esports or JD Gaming? Who's joining Bilibili in the finals, and who do you think would be taking that finals at their current state? Do you think Top Esports has the juice to be able to push back BLG, who, you know, looked pretty competitive in their series against them, or does JDG have some secrets up their sleeves in order for them to get across the finish line? I would love to know if you believe in either of those teams, or do you think BLG is just going to walk to a finals, their first finals ever? Would love to know your thoughts on everything down below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. You know, LPL content's going to be coming out, but we don't only cover the LPL on this channel. We cover the LEC and the LCK playoffs as well. You know, NA, but they're done. They've wrapped up a while ago. MSI is also just around the corner, so if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.